You know, I've often wondered if there's a special kind of competitive event for HOA board members, something like the Entitlement Olympics, maybe. Because if there is, I'm pretty sure our former HOA president, Bartholomew Barty Pompous, would have taken home the gold, the silver, and probably tried to fine the judges for not awarding him platinum. Ever had someone think they own your property more than you do, even when your family's name has been on the deed since before their cookie-cutter subdivision was even a twinkle in a developer's eye? Well, I had 3 of these HOA-appointed officers, Barty and his 2 loyal acolytes, who decided my century-old barn was suddenly community property, a place ripe for their unsolicited inspection. Their little field trip took a rather unexpected turn, right up until they had a very personal, very up-close encounter with my 2 prize-winning 2,500-pound Charolais bulls, Brutus and Goliath. Stick around, because this story isn't just wild. It's a testament to what happens when bureaucratic buffoonery meets agricultural reality. Drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from. I'm betting some of you have HOA stories that could curl your hair, but I'd wager few involve actual livestock, acting as unpaid and very effective security guards. And believe me, by the end of this, you'll understand why I say that sometimes the best way to deal with bullies is to let them corner themselves, preferably with several tons of unimpressed beef. My farm isn't some quaint hobby setup, it's a working operation, spread over a respectable acreage that's been in my family for 4 generations. We were here long before the Whispering Pines Estates decided to whisper its way right up to our property line, bringing with it a tide of beige houses, meticulously manicured lawns, and an HOA with an ego far exceeding its actual jurisdiction. My land, with its rolling pastures, ancient oaks, and yes, the aforementioned barn, was distinctly, legally, and historically not part of Whispering Pines. We were grandfathered in, a fact clearly stated in every relevant county record and even, amusingly, in the HOA's own founding documents, a detail they seemed to conveniently forget whenever it suited them. I raise Charolais cattle, magnificent, cream-colored beasts, and my bulls, Brutus and Goliath, are the heart of my breeding program. They're generally placid, as bulls go, but they are undeniably enormous, powerful animals who command respect, and they don't particularly care for uninvited guests in their domain. I value my privacy, my peace, and my right to conduct my agricultural business without interference. These were concepts apparently alien to Mr. Bartholomew Pompous. Barty ascended to the HOA presidency about a year before things really came to a head. He was new to the neighborhood, having bought one of the larger, slightly more ostentatious houses on the edge of the development. The kind that tries too hard to look like old money but just ends up looking like a catalog threw up. He drove a gleaming cherry-red pickup truck, the kind with aggressively oversized tires and enough chrome to blind an astronaut. Yet it never seemed to have a speck of dust or a single tool in the bed. It was purely a status symbol, much like his golf shirts, which he wore to every occasion, including HOA meetings held in the sterile community clubhouse, as if he'd just stepped off the 18th green at Augusta. His demeanor was a finely tuned blend of condescension and self-importance, and he spoke with a plummy, booming voice that brooked no argument, at least in his own mind. He quickly gathered a small retinue of equally clueless board members, chief among them Gary and Kevin, 2 yes-men who seemed to bask in the reflected, albeit dim, glow of Barty's authority. Gary was a nervous, bird-like man who fidgeted constantly, while Kevin had a perpetually bewildered expression, as if he'd wandered into the wrong meeting and was too polite to leave. Together, they formed Barty's unofficial enforcement squad, his HOA cops. The trouble started subtly, as these things often do. First, it was a polite, almost laughably misdirected notice of violation slipped into my mailbox. It cited a rule about lawn height and unmown grass. I glanced over at my 5-acre pasture, currently hosting a dozen happily grazing cows, and chuckled. I wrote a polite, equally brief note back, explaining that it was a pasture, not a lawn, and attached a copy of the county agricultural zoning for my parcel. I figured that would be the end of it. Oh, how naive I was. That was like waving a red flag, not at a bull, but at a bureaucrat with a bruised ego. Barty, it turned out, didn't appreciate being corrected, especially not by someone whose property he viewed as a rustic eyesore, marring the pristine uniformity of his suburban paradise. Old Man Hemlock, my neighbor to the east, a fellow farmer whose land also abutted Whispering Pines, had warned me. "That pompous fella," he'd said, spitting tobacco juice with practiced accuracy into a coffee can. "He's got ambitions, wants to civilize the whole damn area, make it look like one of them fancy magazines. Thinks a pitchfork is something you use for an hors d'oeuvre." At the time, I'd merely nodded, thinking Hemlock was perhaps being a touch overly dramatic. I soon learned he was, if anything, understating the case. Barty wasn't just ambitious. He was on a mission, a crusade to bring my farm to heel, to make it conform to his vision of orderly, sanitized living, regardless of history, legality, or basic common sense. My initial attempts at reason, my patient explanations of grandfather clauses and agricultural exemptions, were met with what I can only describe as a smug, knowing smirk. It was the smirk of a man who believed rules were for other people, and that his interpretation of those rules was paramount. The battle lines, it seemed, were being drawn, not in the soil of my farm, but in the petty ambitions of one HOA president. The fines began to appear shortly after my polite rebuttal regarding the pasture. These weren't just misdirected notices anymore. They were targeted, increasingly ludicrous accusations. There was a fine for unapproved livestock, which made me laugh out loud, considering my family had been raising livestock on this land since before Barty's great-grandparents were born. Then came complaints about excessive noise. Mooing, apparently, was now a disturbance of the peace in Whispering Pines. The rich aroma of a working farm, something I'd always found rather wholesome, was suddenly reclassified as a noxious odor. Each fine arrived in an official-looking envelope, complete with a due date and threats of further action if not paid promptly. I, of course, paid none of them. Instead, for each one, I drafted a more detailed, more legally pointed letter, citing specific ordinances, property rights, and the HOA's own bylaws that explicitly excluded my property from such regulations. I sent these registered mail, return receipt requested, creating a very clear paper trail of their harassment and my entirely reasonable responses. This, however, only seemed to pour gasoline on Barty's simmering fire. He and his two shadows, Gary and Kevin, began what they probably considered subtle surveillance. I'd spot them near my property line, Barty often aiming his phone like he was documenting some egregious crime, Gary jotting furiously in a little notebook, and Kevin just sort of looming, looking confused. Any attempt on my part to even wave hello was, I later learned, twisted in their reports into aggressive posturing or attempts at intimidation. The irony was richer than my best compost. It became clear that reason and documentation, while legally sound, weren't going to deter a man like Barty Pompous. His ego was now fully engaged. He saw my refusals to bend to his will not as a legitimate defense of my rights, but as a personal affront, a challenge to his authority. So, I decided it was time to shift from reactive defense to proactive preparation. I started by calling my friend Sarah, a sharp, no-nonsense lawyer who specialized in property disputes. After I'd laid out the escalating harassment, she let out a low whistle. "This Barty fellow," she said, "sounds like a classic petty tyrant. Hoboards can be bad, but he's taking it to a whole new level. Good thing you've kept every piece of paper." "We can definitely use that." She confirmed what I already suspected. The HOA had absolutely zero authority over my operational farm practices, and their continued attempts to fine and intimidate me constituted harassment. She advised me on the specific language to use in future correspondence and suggested I bolster my existing security. I already had a few cameras, mostly for monitoring livestock, but I invested in a more comprehensive system, covering all access points to my property, particularly the areas bordering Whispering Pines, and especially around the barn. Every notice, Every sighting of Barty's gleaming red truck cruising slowly past my fence line, every furtive click of a camera shutter from their side, was logged, dated, and where possible, captured on video. My file on Mr. Pompous and his HOA cops was growing thicker by the day. The other residents of Whispering Pines were a mixed bag. Many were perfectly pleasant people who just wanted to live their lives and probably found Barty as tiresome as I did, but were too cowed or too busy to challenge him. These were the unwitting enablers, their silence allowing his power to fester. A few, however, particularly some of the older residents who remembered when the area was more rural, were quietly supportive. Mrs. Henderson, a sweet lady whose garden backed up to one of my fields, would occasionally leave a pie on my porch with a whispered word of encouragement. "Don't let that man bully you, dear," she'd say, her eyes darting nervously towards the street. Then there were Gary and Kevin, Barty's loyal lieutenants. Gary, I suspected, was mostly just scared of Barty. He had the perpetually anxious look of someone who expected to be yelled at any moment. Kevin, on the other hand, seemed to genuinely enjoy the sliver of power he got from riding Barty's coattails. He'd puff out his chest a bit when they were on their patrols, though he deflated quickly if I actually made eye contact. They were, in essence, the Laurel and Hardy of HOA enforcement, if Laurel and Hardy had been actively malicious instead of just bumbling. The next major salvo from Barty was a violation notice for unapproved structures. He was referring, of course, to my barn. My beautiful, historic, 100-year-old barn, which had stood on that spot weathering storms and sheltering animals long before a single foundation was poured in Whispering Pines. The sheer audacity was breathtaking. This wasn't just a misinterpretation of a bylaw. This was a declaration of war on my heritage. I conferred with Sarah again. Her advice was succinct. Hit him with the history books, literally, if you have to. So, I composed my most detailed letter yet. It included copies of the original property deeds, historic survey maps, showing the barn's existence dating back to the early 20th century, county assessor records, and even a charmingly faded photograph of my great-grandfather standing proudly in front of it with his first team of draft horses. I pointed out, in a tone that I hoped conveyed polite bewilderment at their astounding ignorance, that not only was the barn grandfathered in, but it was also a recognized historical feature of the local landscape. I sent it off, complete with a cover letter suggesting that perhaps Mr. Pompous should invest in a local history book rather than continuing to waste HOA funds on frivolous and legally baseless attacks. This, I knew, would sting. Barty didn't strike me as a man who enjoyed history lessons, especially when they proved him comprehensively, unequivocally wrong. His response when it came wasn't a letter. It was an escalation, a doubling down that reeked of wounded pride. He started telling people, or so the rumors filtering back through Mrs. Henderson suggested, that I was uncooperative, hostile, and possibly even hiding something in that barn of mine. "We're the authority here," he'd apparently declared at the last HOA meeting, thumping his chest for emphasis. "And we will get to the bottom of what's happening on that property." The subtext was clear. He was coming for my barn, one way or another. And I started to think about Brutus and Goliath, and how unimpressed they'd be with his authority. Barty Pompous, it turned out, was not a man to be deterred by facts, laws, or common decency. His ego, having been thoroughly bruised by my documented rebuttals, had now metastasized into a full-blown obsession. The rumors Mrs. Henderson had relayed intensified. Barty was apparently spinning tales at HOA meetings, and to anyone in Whispering Pines who would listen, painting me as a reclusive, potentially dangerous character. The narrative he was crafting was that my farm was a blight, a holdout against progress, and that my insistence on privacy was merely a cover for nefarious activities. What nefarious activities one could conduct on a Charolais cattle farm, short of aggressive mooing, was left to the listener's imagination, but the implication was clear. I was the villain in his carefully constructed drama. The barn, my beautiful, historic barn, became the focal point of his suspicion. He was convinced, or at least pretended to be, that I was using it for something unsavory, perhaps in his fevered imagination, running a secret rodeo or storing contraband hay. The reality, of course, was far more mundane. It housed tools, some winter feed, and occasionally my bulls when they needed to be separated or were awaiting veterinary attention. But facts were mere inconveniences to Barty's crusade. He was going to get inside that barn, and he was going to find something to justify his persecution. The official-looking letter arrived on a Monday. It was printed on HOA letterhead, full of self-important legal-sounding jargon, and signed by Bartholomew Pompous President, with a flourish that suggested he imagined himself signing treaties. It announced an emergency health and safety inspection of all outbuildings on my property, scheduled for Wednesday afternoon. The reason cited was multiple anonymous complaints regarding potential structural instability and unsanitary conditions posing a risk to the community. Anonymous complaints, of course. The oldest trick in the petty tyrant's handbook. There was no mention of needing my permission, no request for a convenient time. It was a demand, an assertion of authority they simply didn't possess. I immediately called Sarah. She laughed, a short, sharp bark of amusement. An emergency inspection? Of a barn that stood for a century? What do they think is going to happen? A sudden outbreak of rogue pigeons. They have absolutely no legal right to set foot on your property without your explicit permission or a court order, Barty's delusions notwithstanding. She confirmed that any entry would be trespass. Pure and simple. So, she asked, a smile in her voice, what are you thinking? And that's when the glimmer of an idea involving two very large bulls and one very arrogant HOA president, began to take shape. It wasn't just about proving him wrong anymore. It was about giving him an unforgettable lesson in property rights and the inadvisability of poking a sleeping farmer. The plan was simple, elegant even, in its agricultural pragmatism. Wednesday morning, I was up before dawn, as usual. I made sure Brutus and Goliath were contentedly grazing in the far western pasture, a good half-mile from the barn and completely out of sight from the road or the Whispering Pines fence line. The barn itself I left as it always was, doors closed, but not locked. An old barn like mine didn't have modern locks. It had a heavy wooden crossbar on the inside of the main double doors and simple latches on the smaller side doors. The key was that from the outside, the main doors would appear to be merely shut, perhaps even slightly ajar if pushed. My security cameras were all active, newly cleaned lenses gleaming, covering every approach to the barn, the main yard, and crucially, the interior of the barn from multiple angles. I had a clear view of the connecting gate between the barn's main area and the attached large corral, a gate I could operate quietly from a discreet position. Once everything was set, I loaded my fishing gear into my old truck. My alibi was going to be impeccable. A peaceful afternoon trying to outsmart the local base population at Miller's Pond, a well-known local spot a few miles away. I even called my friend Dave, who also loved to fish, and invited him along. A witness to my entirely innocent pastime wouldn't hurt. Right on schedule, around 2 p.m., my phone, linked to the security camera feed, buzzed with a motion alert. There they were, Barty Pompous in the lead, flanked by Gary and Kevin, marching up my private driveway like they were liberating Paris. Barty was, naturally, in his crisp golf attire, looking utterly ridiculous against the backdrop of my working farm. Gary clutched his little notebook like a shield, and Kevin, bless his cotton socks, just looked increasingly nervous the further they got from the paved streets of Whispering Pines. They paused at the edge of the yard, peering towards the house, then towards the silent, imposing barn. I watched on my phone screen as Barty gestured emphatically towards the barn, clearly making his case. After a moment of what looked like Gary's hesitant questioning and Kevin's gormless nodding, Barty strode purposefully towards the main barn doors. He pushed one. It creaked open a few inches. He peered inside, then with a smug look back at his cohorts, he pushed it further and slipped inside. Gary and Kevin exchanged a worried glance before dutifully following their leader into the gloom. Perfect. They were in. Now it was my turn, though from a comfortable distance. I had previously opened the gate between the far western pasture and the series of smaller paddocks leading to the barn's large, secure corral. With a few quiet calls and a practiced technique, Cherolet are intelligent, and mine know my voice. I had already coaxed Brutus and Goliath from their distant grazing spot into the paddock closest to the barn. They were calm, merely curious. Once Barty and his crew were well inside the barn, snooping around my neatly stacked hay bales and antique farming implements, I made my move, unseen from their vantage point. A preset rope, running discreetly through a series of eyelets I'd installed years ago for just such remote animal handling, allowed me to smoothly, silently swing open the heavy internal gate that separated the large empty corral from the main barn floor, where my uninvited guests were conducting their inspection. Then, with another familiar call, much softer this time, just enough to pique their interest, I encouraged Brutus and Goliath to amble from the corral directly into the spacious central area of the barn, 2.5 tons of bull moving with surprising quietness on the thick bedding straw. Once they were fully inside, sniffing the air, probably wondering why their usual quiet sanctuary was disturbed, I released the rope for the internal gate. It swung shut with a muted thud. Then, and this was the part I savored, I strolled, quite casually, from my vantage point behind a dense stand of lilac bushes near my vegetable garden, over to the main barn doors. I glanced around, as if checking the weather, then firmly slid the heavy external wooden bolt across, securing the doors from the outside. The satisfying clunk echoed slightly in the afternoon air. Right, I thought. Barn secured. Animals contained. Trespassers also contained. Time to go fishing. I hopped into my truck, gave a cheerful wave to Mrs. Pline Henderson, who happened to be tending her roses, and gave me a knowing, almost imperceptible nod, and rumbled off down the drive, whistling a jaunty tune. The bass at Miller's Pond were calling. The next few hours at Miller's Pond were, I must admit, some of the most relaxing I'd had in weeks. Dave and I didn't catch much, a couple of undersized perch and one feisty bluegill, but the company was good, and the mental image of Barty, Pompous, Gary, and Kevin sharing close quarters with Brutus and Goliath provided a certain quiet satisfaction that no trophy fish could match. I imagined the scene inside the barn, the initial confusion, the dawning realization that they were not alone, followed by sheer, unadulterated panic. Brutus and Goliath aren't aggressive, unless seriously provoked, but they are incredibly imposing. Goliath, the larger of the two, has a habit of snorting loudly and shaking his massive head when he's curious or mildly annoyed, a display that can be quite unnerving if you're not used to it. Brutus is more of a silent observer, but his sheer bulk and the intelligent, appraising way he looks at you can make even a seasoned cattleman pause. For 3 suburbanites who probably considered a squirrel in the attic a major wildlife crisis, it must have been terrifying. I pictured them scrambling for cover, perhaps trying to climb into the hayloft, all while Barty no doubt tried to maintain some semblance of his shattered authority, probably blaming Gary and Kevin for the predicament. I gave them a good 3 hours. Enough time, I reckoned, for the gravity of their trespassing and the sheer folly of their arrogance to truly sink in. Around 5 o'clock, with the sun beginning to dip towards the horizon, Dave and I packed up our gear. I dropped him off, then made a leisurely drive back to the farm. As I pulled into my driveway, I noticed something amiss. Or rather, I pretended to notice something amiss. There were distinct, albeit muffled, sounds of distress coming from the direction of the barn, shouts, a few bangs, nothing that sounded like animal distress, more like human frustration. I parked the truck, adopted an expression of mild concern, and strolled towards the barn. "Hello?" I called out, pitching my voice to sound inquisitive. "Anyone there?" The shouting intensified, and I could now make out Barty's distinctive booming voice, though it was laced with a healthy dose of hysteria. "Help! Get us out of here! There are beasts in here!" I reached the main barn doors, the ones I'd so carefully bolted. "Well, I'll be," I said, loud enough for them to hear. "What's all this then?" I could hear them scrambling towards the door from the inside. "It's Pompous. Open this door immediately. We're trapped." "Trapped?" I asked, feigning surprise. Trapped with what, Mr. Pompous? I made sure my phone was recording audio, a feature I'd discreetly activated as I approached. With your enormous cows, bulls, whatever they are, they're going to kill us, he shrieked, his voice cracking. Gary was whimpering something in the background, and Kevin sounded like he was praying. My bulls? I said, affecting a tone of dawning realization. Brutus and Goliath? What on earth are you doing in my barn with my bulls, Mr. Pompous? And how did you get locked in? The wind must have blown the bolt shut. It does that sometimes with a good gust. I heard a sputtering noise from the other side. Don't be ridiculous. You locked us in here with these monsters, Barty yelled. Now, Mr. Pompous, I said calmly. Accusations won't get you anywhere. First tell me, why were you in my barn? I don't recall inviting you. In fact, I seem to recall a rather official-looking letter about an emergency inspection, which my lawyer assures me is utter nonsense without my consent or a warrant. Were you, by any chance, trespassing on my private property? There was a pregnant pause, filled only by Gary's soft sobbing and a deep, resonant snort from, I presumed, Goliath. Finally, Barty, his voice tight with fury and fear, choked out, All right, fine, yes, we were inspecting. Now, for God's sake, let us out. So you admit you were trespassing? I pressed gently. Yes, trespassing. Whatever you want. Just open the door, he screamed. Thank you, Mr. Pompous, I said sweetly. That's all I needed to hear. I then, very slowly, drew back the heavy bolt. The three of them practically fell out, blinking in the fading light, covered in straw, dust, and what looked suspiciously like a fresh cowpat on Barty's pristine golf slacks. They looked utterly wretched. Gary was pale and trembling. Kevin looked like he'd seen a ghost, and Barty, despite his dishevelment, was vibrating with impotent rage. Brutus and Goliath merely blinked at them from the shadowy interior of the barn, then went back to munching on some hay I'd left in their manger. They couldn't have cared less. I trust your inspection was illuminating? I asked, unable to keep a slight smirk off my face. Barty puffed himself up, or tried to. This is an outrage. You deliberately endangered us. We're calling the police. You'll be hearing from our lawyer. I just smiled. Oh, I certainly hope I do hear from a lawyer, Mr. Pompous, because I have a wonderful recording of you admitting to trespass. Several hours of security footage showing you illegally entering my barn, and a very clear case for harassment and intentional infliction of emotional distress, though in your case, it seems more like intentional infliction of a much-needed reality check. My lawyer, Sarah, will be in touch. Please, do show yourselves off my property. They stumbled away, Barty still sputtering threats, Gary looking like he was about to be sick, and Kevin trailing behind, occasionally glancing back at the barn with wide, terrified eyes. As soon as they were clear, I called Sarah. Phase 1 complete, I told her. They sang like canaries. She chuckled. Excellent. Let them make the first move with the police. It'll be hilarious. And indeed, about an hour later, a county sheriff's car pulled up. Barty, Gary, and Kevin were with him, looking slightly more composed but still radiating indignation. This was going to be fun. The officer, a Deputy Miller I knew vaguely from the feed store, looked tired. Evening, folks. Got a bit of a situation here, it seems. Barty immediately launched into a tirade about being assaulted, falsely imprisoned, and nearly gored by savage beasts. I listened patiently, then calmly invited Deputy Miller into my kitchen to review some security footage. The look on Barty's face as I queued up the video of them sneaking into my barn, followed by their panicked Keystone Cops routine when Brutus and Goliath made their entirely peaceful entrance, was priceless. Then I played him the audio of Barty's clear admission of trespassing. Deputy Miller, to his credit, managed to keep a straight face, though his mustache twitched suspiciously. He then had a quiet word with Barty, Gary, and Kevin out by his car. I couldn't hear what was said, but their faces fell progressively further. The upshot was, no charges against me. Instead, Deputy Miller gave Barty a stern warning about criminal trespass, and advised him that any further inspections without a warrant would see him in cuffs. Gary and Kevin looked like they wanted the earth to swallow them. As they drove away, dejected and silent in Barty's ostentatious, but now slightly less gleaming, red truck, Sarah called. Heard the police scanner. Sounds like Barty's bluff got called. Ready to lower the boom? Oh, I replied, watching the taillights of Barty's Folly disappear down the road. I'm more than ready. The following days were a whirlwind of legal strategy and information gathering. Though the best evidence was already in hand thanks to Barty's own arrogance, Sarah was magnificent. She drafted a formal cease and desist letter to Bartholomew Pompous personally, and to the Whispering Pines HOA board collectively, detailing his campaign of harassment, the illegal trespass, and the subsequent false police report. The letter demanded his immediate resignation as HOA president, a formal written apology to me, the immediate cancellation of all outstanding illegitimate fines, and a legally binding agreement that the HOA would never again attempt to assert authority over my property or interfere with my agricultural operations. It also included a not-so-subtle hint that failure to comply would result in a rather hefty lawsuit for damages, citing harassment, defamation, trespass, and a few other choice legal terms that Sarah wielded like a surgeon's scalpel. Attached to the letter were select stills from the security footage. Barty peering into the barn, the three of them inside looking like guilty schoolchildren, and a particularly unflattering shot of Barty trying to climb a stack of hay bales to escape the entirely placid bulls. We also included a transcript of his recorded admission of trespass. It was, as Sarah put it, an open and shut case of bully meets bull, bully loses. The reaction from the HOA board, once they received Sarah's package, was reportedly one of stunned silence, followed by panicked internal discussions. Gary and Kevin, it turned out, were not quite as loyal to Barty when faced with the prospect of being named individually in a lawsuit. Rumor had it, via Mrs. Henderson's surprisingly effective intelligence network, that Gary had broken down in tears during an emergency board meeting, confessing that Barty had pressured them into the inspection and that he just wanted it all to go away. Kevin, ever the follower, quickly echoed Gary's sentiments, apparently very keen to distance himself from Barty's sinking ship. The rest of the board members, who had previously been content to let Barty run roughshod, were suddenly very concerned about their own potential liability and the HOA's rapidly dwindling legal defense fund, which Barty had apparently been dipping into for his various vendettas. It turned out that my case was not the only instance of his overreach. Several other homeowners in Whispering Pines had also been subjected to his petty tyrannies and arbitrary fining. Though none had possessed the unique deterrence I had at my disposal, my situation, however, was the most flagrant and, thanks to the bulls, the most dramatically embarrassing for him. The smoking gun, as Sarah called it, wasn't just one piece of evidence, but the entire tapestry of Barty's escalating misconduct, culminating in the barn incident. The video footage of their trespass was damning. Barty's arrogant demeanor on camera, contrasted with his later panic shrieks, painted a vivid picture of a bully whose bluff had been called in spectacular fashion. His desperate, recorded admission of trespass sealed his fate legally. But perhaps the most damaging element for him within the community was the sheer ridicule. The story, naturally, began to leak out, first in hushed whispers, then in more open, amused conversations throughout Whispering Pines. The mental image of the HOA president and his deputies being treed by a pair of unimpressed bulls was just too delicious. Barty Pompous, the man who prided himself on his authority and his meticulously maintained image, became a laughingstock. His expensive, always spotless red pickup truck, once a symbol of his perceived status, now just seemed to highlight his absurdity. Someone even cheekily suggested, at the next HOA meeting, from which Barty was conspicuously absent, claiming a sudden illness, that perhaps the HOA should invest in bull-proof uniforms for its officers. The laughter was reportedly deafening. The showdown, when it came, wasn't a dramatic courtroom battle, but a rather swift and ignominious capitulation. Faced with irrefutable evidence, the threat of a costly lawsuit, and the wholesale desertion of his former allies on the board, Barty had no cards left to play. Within a week of receiving Sarah's letter, the HOA board convened a special session. The outcome was decisive. Bartholomew Pompous submitted his resignation as president and from the board entirely, effective immediately. The board issued a formal, if somewhat grudgingly worded, apology to me, which I accepted with a magnanimous nod. All outstanding fines against my property were rescinded and expunged from their records. They also signed a legally binding covenant, drafted by Sarah, acknowledging my farm's grandfathered status and agreeing to cease all attempts to enforce Whispering Pines HOA regulations on my land. It was a comprehensive victory. Barty, I heard, put his house on the market shortly thereafter. The last I saw of him, he was driving his gleaming red truck away from Whispering Pines, probably heading for some other unsuspecting community to inflict his particular brand of managerial incompetence upon. I almost felt a twinge of pity for them. Almost. As for Gary and Kevin, they faded back into the beige anonymity of the subdivision, stripped of their vicarious authority and likely subjects of neighborhood snickers for months to come. Kevin, I heard, even developed a sudden aversion to beef. The downfall of Barty Pompous had broader positive changes for Whispering Pines, too. The subsequent HOA election brought in a new slate of board members who were far more reasonable and community-minded. They seemed to understand that their role was to maintain common areas and facilitate neighborhood harmony, not to wage suburban warfare against anyone who didn't fit their narrow definition of acceptable. My relations with the HOA improved dramatically. They actually started treating me like a neighbor rather than an adversary. Mrs. Henderson even nominated me to advise on a community garden project, citing my extensive agricultural expertise, which made me chuckle. I politely declined but offered some surplus compost. The farm, my sanctuary, was finally left in peace. The mooing of my cattle was once again just the sound of a working farm, not a finable offense. Brutus and Goliath continued their placid existence, entirely unaware of the pivotal role they'd played in restoring a modicum of sanity to the neighborhood. They were, however, rewarded with extra helpings of their favorite sweet feed. Looking back, the whole affair feels almost surreal, like a strange, stress-filled dream that ended with a surprisingly satisfying thud, the thud of a heavy barn bolt sliding home, perhaps. There are lessons in it, of course, about standing up for your rights, about the importance of meticulous record-keeping, and about how unchecked ego can lead people to do spectacularly foolish things. There's also a lesson about the unique, persuasive power of 2.5 tons of unamused bull. I learned that even in the face of bureaucratic overreach and personal vendettas, a well-planned, legally sound, and slightly audacious response can achieve remarkable results. There's a distinct David versus Goliath satisfaction in it all, though in my case, Goliath was on my side, munching hay. The sheer incredulity of Barty's audacity still astounds me sometimes, but it's overshadowed by the grim satisfaction of his self-inflicted downfall. My barn is more secure than ever, not because of new locks, but because of the legend that now surrounds it. I sometimes wonder if new residents of Whispering Pines are warned, in hushed tones, about the farmer with the bulls and the very firm understanding of property lines. It's a reputation I don't mind at all. So, what's the craziest HOA story you've ever encountered? Or perhaps you've had your own run-in with a Barty Pompous? Drop a comment below and share your experiences. And if you enjoyed this little tale of when keeping it rural decisively met suburban overreach, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more stories. You never know when the next one might involve more livestock outsmarting the so-called authorities.